All right, welcome back. We're now going to hear from RichiH about the future of the Prometheus in the ecosystem. Brian, roll the clip. Yeah.
This is actually me. We're doing this live. So yeah.
Oh no, live.
Oh yes. Let's see if that one works. So welcome to the future of Prometheus. Um, let's start with a quick recap of what happened since the last PromCon. For 2.14, the highlight feature was definitely the React UI. It's still experimental and it hasn't reached feature parity yet, but it's slowly getting there. And if you have a Prometheus, which is 2.14 or new, which you should have, you'll find a small thing in the upper right, which lets you try the new React-based UI. And it's super nice. For 2.15, we have the metadata API. We have exposed or supported help type and such information for ages within Prometheus exposition format, but we haven't really done anything with it. So now we have an API for externalizing this kind of data. And here you can see the Grafana Explore UI taking advantage of this to show the user what they're actually looking at and just giving more context about what they're currently building, what they're currently digging down into. 2.16 was mostly about improvements and stability. If I had to highlight two things, it would probably be time zone support for anyone who's not working in UTC. You can just set your time zone locally. And also there is the query log, which is a feature request from 2016. So it's nice to finally have a tick mark next to that one. Speaking about really old stuff, isolation, the I in ACID databases. And fun fact, if you remember that particular slide from just now from Ganesh's talk, that's because both him and me stole it from Gotham. So ACID stands for atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. And it's super nice to finally have isolation. 2.18 was mainly about tracing exemplars within Prometheus, and thus obviously also Cortex and Thanos. And you can now really drill down into stuff, but also you have exemplar support. And for those who don't know German, Jäger or Jäger in German means hunter, a hunter who's literally looking at traces. As to why that hunter is hunting humans, I don't know. 2.19, RAM, and memory. This is insane. Going from up to above 30, like 33, down to maybe 16-ish, that's 50% optimization. And on the one hand, it's super nice to see that we have that kind of potential within Prometheus still. It's also somewhat scary, to be honest. If you look at those 2-hour blocks of stuff rising on the left-hand side, you might be able to guess where that optimization was happening. 2.20, when preparing this talk, I mentioned how this was a slowish release, and I was absolutely wrong. As Julian noted, this is the longest changelog since 2.6. But what's even more important than the fact that we support 2 random storage service discovery mechanisms, it's that we are uncrusting parts of Prometheus and taking a fresh look at many old decisions, many old consensus positions. Because frankly, the world has changed, and arguably we changed the world, and we need to take this into account here and in other places. So we're just starting to ease up on a few things which we held stronger opinions on in the past. Last thing in the look back, Node Exporter is finally 1.0, and it has TLS export support, which is marked as experimental. And CNCF is sponsoring yet another, or the second review by Cure53 of a thing in the Prometheus ecosystem. The first one was focused on Prometheus. This one is focused on TLS with Node Exporter and Node Exporter as a general thing. Initial results are looking pretty good, and obviously we'll be publishing the report in full. We will probably get that report next Monday was the initial promise. It might be a little bit later. We'll see. But once we have it, we'll publish it. So pivoting to looking into the future, there is a thing. Sometimes I do get the feeling that we as a project are resting on our laurels, and I honestly don't like it. Some time ago, I started a Grafana internal brainstorming document with the title Prometheus is not feature complete. And I also asked Red Hat to do the same. We took those, threw them together into a large brainstorming document, threw them in Prometheus team mailing list. And now this is a document where we can discuss and brainstorm about all the things. And this is already bearing fruit. And as soon as topics are mature enough to actually be discussed, they're broken into Dev Summit discussion points. Which brings us to the Dev Summit. Obviously, COVID made things a little bit icky for us as well. Of course, we couldn't have an in-person thing, which we would normally be having right after PromCon, and ideally also during PromCon Europe, which is what we did last year, two summits. So we have a solution, shorter, more often, and virtual. And instead of doing 1 or 2 full days of Dev Summiting at once, we're now doing 4-hour blocks. The first one was last Friday. The next one will be early August. And we'll basically keep doing them until our backlog is empty, but we still have quite a bit of backlog and we keep adding more and more to the Prometheus is not feature complete thing. So I want to do 2 things now. First, I want to walk you through what we agreed upon. And also just FYI, that is structured in a way which is basically like we collect stuff, then we vote upon stuff, what we care about, and what has the most votes is discussed first. So this also gives you an indication about what we within team care about the most, because that's the order we'll be going through. But this also brings us to the next point. I want to share a little bit of background of how I run those meetings and what the underlying considerations are. I will probably also write a blog post or 2 about this thing, because that's a request I've been hearing a lot recently, writing or externalizing how to actually run things like this and how you can find consensus, how you can enable a group to have a good and healthy discussion while not shutting anyone down or anything. So without much further ado, metadata. Metadata again is starting to be useful in Prometheus. See the 2.15 thing. But we need to do more, especially propagated through the remote read-write API. There's also lots of interesting questions around what to do with metadata when you persist it, especially when it changes, when it flaps. Like if you have changes, are you storing every single change, which basically turns you into an event storage? Or are you maybe, I don't know, are you limiting to only every 10 minutes? Are you limiting to just the first one past the pause? The last metadata you saw. All of those are considerations which are not easy, especially once you take the second dimension of, is this per time series, per metric name and target? It becomes icky fast, and it's non-trivial to come up with a thing which tends to do what users want to have. But there's also something non-obvious here. If you look at the second consensus position, merging that PR, that has been sitting for quite some time. And we want to actually allow more experimentation within Prometheus proper. We are deliberately easing up a little bit, at least, on a few things. Over time, within Prometheus, we have started to redefine experimental as somewhat approaching stable, which is good on the one hand, because it just tells you what kind of high level of expectations we are setting for ourselves. But on the other hand, that impedes innovation. So we are walking back on this one to some extent, and we'll see where we end up, but we will probably, or we will most certainly be more willing to experiment and also sometimes maybe even take back or change stuff which is marked as experimental. Next, we have some janitorial workflow changes, which are not that interesting, but there's another thing. Initially, we had in the document, which was from, I think I started this document in March, so like for the Dev Summit as preparation for KubeCon EU, we had master in there, and it was changed to main during this Dev Summit for a very simple reason. We are very serious about spearheading this verbiage cleanup. It's admittedly not the most important thing which we could be doing, but this is something which we can do, and so we are doing this. For making the actual changes in the code, we are waiting for GitHub and others to provide more tooling. First and foremost, actually agree on a thing, like most likely main as a name, but we just don't know for certain. Hopefully, maybe Git can also get their act together and change the name. And also, ideally, I would like to have this run, this actual doing through Community Bridge, not just within Prometheus, but in all of the CNCF projects, maybe even in all of the Linux Foundation projects, because this is a quite nice thing. It has an insane amount of touch points for a lot of projects. You get in touch with a lot of people, a lot of different tooling, a lot of different projects, a lot of different working styles. So this is perfect for someone trying to break into the scene. And hopefully this will work out. I'm already in conversation with Priyanka and Chris A about how we could structure this. So we'll keep you posted. Next one is super nice as well, backfilling. And yes, backfilling. Backfilling in Prometheus proper. I can probably hear the people spit their coffee at their screens right now. But also, admittedly, it's a very contentious topic, which is why it took us so long to agree on this one. So the first one is kind of obvious. Yeah, we'll support Prometheus text exposition format and also open metrics, obviously. And one CSV or TSV format, which is well defined for importing data. Okay, that was relatively quick, like not super quick, but that was relatively quick. But then how to do this over the network, if to do it at all. And that's, again, very, very interesting from the Dev Summit point of view. Chris, the first consensus point you're seeing in the second block, we want to support backfilling over the network via blocks, which do not overlap with the head block, is something which I've been rewriting several times over during the discussion and just trying to nail down when we have a potential thing we can actually find consensus on. And the initial reaction was more or less, well, let's finish this discussion. Then I kind of tried to keep people back a little bit and said, okay, now let's make a consensus here. And we wordsmithed a little bit more, and then we actually had this one consensus position. And that was written down, and we knew what the others accepted, and we could base the next work on this. And after quite a bit of back and forth, it was kind of obvious that we would not want to, or at least not find a consensus position on supporting backfilling over the network via streams, which do not overlap with the head block. But this was also a result, in as much as it was a non-result, but still it was a result. So we wrote this down and actually had this as a call for non-consensus and knew what the others actually thought and agreed upon. And that is what allowed us to find the third point, that we would like to support backfilling over the network via blocks, which do overlap with the head block, given proper design. And every single one of these words are wordsmithed to the extreme. Of course, this is the precise extent of the consensus we could find. And doing this in the step-by-step way allowed us to actually find this consensus versus just postponing the point as we did in the past. Next one, vendoring. In my opinion, Go carries a lot of baggage of basically designers being used to having a monorepo where all the immense code base of a certain corporation is living in one huge, humongous repository, so they don't face a few challenges of the actual real world. And Vendor is a prime example of this. So the consensus position is simple. We'll remove it in Node Exporter. We'll see if we like it. But the funny thing here, or the interesting thing from the Dev Summit point of view, it was obvious pretty much at the beginning of the discussion that we would find consensus on precisely this. We would try and remove it. It would be Ben who would be volunteering, and we would be trying this in Node Exporter first and seeing what explodes. Of course, that's what we always do. And that's also what I wrote down at the beginning of that discussion. And I think most people didn't notice. And there was a discussion for quite some time about all this stuff. And I just let it run and didn't mention it. And in the end, I called for consensus, and consensus was found. But the funny thing here, or the important thing here, is by allowing people to just talk about it and just talk it through and think it through at their own pace, we were actually able to find a consensus position instead of me just suggesting something and ramming it through, which actually allowed people to come to this conclusion on their own, whereas if it was just presented, they wouldn't have felt as good about this. Next one is also janitorial. As you probably know, China blocks Google, and we will adapt our documentation to make it easier for Chinese users to participate. If you use this email address, that actually works. I tried it some time ago. And that means you don't have to rely on the web interface of Google to subscribe to our mailing list. We'll make this part of the documentation. The other thing is janitorial stuff around IRC channels, and obviously XKCD 1782 applies. There was a ton of bike shedding about everyone's favorite instant messenger, and in the end, IRC won. So yeah. Next one is something which is very, very dear to my heart. It's documentation. I said this during the Dev Summit, and I absolutely mean it. The first thing which I did dislike about Prometheus and what made me almost walk back from it was the documentation, or the non-existence of documentation. We have a reference, but we don't have proper human-friendly, human-consumable documentation. And also, especially if you don't already roughly know what you're doing, it's just a valley of pain to walk through. So the consensus position is super nice. Like it's just great. We will restructure our complete documentation. The user manual, which will be new, is the default. It's the thing which will be shown if you just navigate to our site. There will be a lower threshold for contribution. And this actually carries full examples, explanations of underlying concepts, things which you can just copy and paste completely and have a somewhat running config to just get you started, and all these nice things. Sorry. Next, the reference is what we currently have. And we might even start removing stuff from the reference and putting it into the manual, and then just start cross-linking to make the reference even leaner and meaner if you just want the reference. And then expand the user guides and tutorials, preferably on a kind of choose your own adventure thing. I'll probably write a design doc about this one, so we can have Lego bricks of tutorials and design, of guides. Diana Payton, co-worker from Grafana Labs, is the one who will be asking for a style out. She already wrote a few things, like also an overall concept and such for the documentation. So we have a good tech writery approach to actually doing this. And we will really try to not break any links, but if it makes sense, we'll do so and potentially redirect. You can read all of this yourself, and you don't have to frantically write down that URL. This will be merged basically during the Q&A. It's already public, and we'll just link it during the Q&A, and then you can read it yourself. But I would suggest you join the Q&A and you join the breakout sessions and you watch lightning talks, and then you actually read the Dev Summit notes. Next, we come to the ecosystem. First, everyone gets an exporter. So there are thousands of exporters worldwide. And we want to focus on metrics, not on writing HTTP or new HTTPS servers. So there's now a toolkit. It's not finished yet, but it's already pretty nice and helpful. And this allows you to write exporters in an easier way to just speed up writing exporters. Of course, there are thousands and thousands of exporters, but getting more data into Prometheus means more exporters. So have at it. Also, not just in Prometheus, also, for example, in Cortex and Thanos, which are obviously the siblings of Prometheus, and they wouldn't exist without Prometheus. And they do cover use cases which are completely out of scope for Prometheus. Yet we obviously have a huge maintainer overlap between the three projects. Both of those projects are moving from sandbox to incubation stage within CNCF, at least that's my hope. They passed the review and due diligence within SIG observability. They passed the TOC, Technical Oversight Committee, due diligence, and are now in the public comment phase. So if you're subscribed to the TOC mailing list, you can comment on this. And once this period closes, there will be a formal vote by the TOC. And everyone can vote +1 or -1 non-binding if they want to. So I was talking about SIG observability. What is that? There is a new SIG in town. And now that we're done with the action items, which were basically handed directly to us from TOC, as in due diligence or review of Cortex and Thanos, we're free to do some stuff which we want to do or which we also want to do, let's say. One of them, best current practice documents. So we probably focus on metrics and metric naming and considerations about when to use a counter, when to use the gauge and such first. And this will partially mean just copying stuff over from Prometheus, obviously, but basically also how to run a system, how to instrument a system, a lot of things of just how should you be doing all this stuff, how should you be using it. The other thing which we'll be looking at is data analysis, and we are currently defining use cases for data analysis, and then we'll move further once we have all the use cases down. You're more than welcome to join us. We have a call every second Tuesday at 1600 UTC. There is a mailing list, there is a Slack channel, and there's lots of friendly faces who will welcome new friendly faces. Next, open metrics. And yes, I know this is a long topic. Someone asked if we would finally be done by 2030, and I made the joke that we would be done by 2031 due to COVID. But actually, we are making good progress on tightening up this prose document, which has pages upon pages upon pages of text, into something which is actually concise and can be considered a standard. But this was basically needed to do it this way, so that's what we're currently doing. But we are already seeing benefits from this. We're already seeing vendors and companies committing to this, even though it's not fully published. But also exemplars in Prometheus and thus Cortex and Thanos are a direct result of open metrics. If we hadn't done this within open metrics, Prometheus wouldn't support exemplars, plain and simple. Also, I joined the open telemetry calls. We are on track to be a first-class exposition format of open telemetry. I dare say, or I hope that Prometheus experience and also those years of open metrics discussions proved useful to open telemetry in some points, because I was just able to say, okay, we looked at this and these were the arguments, these were the pros, the cons, this is what we came up with. On the other hand, not wanting to trample over what work had been done before. And now we come to the last thing, also related to open metrics. When I started open metrics in 2016, I wanted to tackle metrics, logs, traces in this order. And the intention behind open metrics was always to also have the other thing, which is part of why the GitHub org is called open observability and not open metrics. There have been many discussions in the background over the years, and I'm personally super excited to see Loki take shape behind the scenes and also front and center. Of course, now you have something where metrics and logs have the same data model for accessing your data. So this means you can jump seamlessly from your graphs to your events and back to your graphs. And speaking of graphs from events, next version of Loki will support extracting metrics directly from your logs with running queries on the side. But there is another aspect to the ecosystem. And in tech, we tend to take the view that politics should be kept out. And in my opinion, this is fundamentally wrong. Open source is a fundamentally political movement. It's literally a thing to change society, to create equality and freedom. And people not seeing the need to address all those concerns is a fundamental misunderstanding of society and of privilege. So if you feel uncomfortable hearing Black Lives Matter, congratulations, you're a target audience.
Thanks, Richie. So I have to ask, how much do you love about your new presentation software?
It's horrible. I've been working with Google Slides quite a bit recently, ever since joining Grafana, and I hate every single minute of it. LaTeX Beamer is so much more efficient and so much better in every single regard, other than putting graphics and animated GIFs in. The workflow of creating and rearranging your train of thought and finding this this story through what you're actually talking is so much easier to restructure with LaTeX. And also, quite honestly, you don't have to care about all the formatting bits because it just happens. I'm actually considering to make someone write a Beamer template which follows the Grafana style guide for reasons.
All right, questions from the Q&A. I assume this is about the Prometheus binaries flags are half of the configuration, but you can't find them on the web. Are we going to include them in the documentation? Will the documentation show differences in the flags across versions?
Sorry, come again with the first part of what you said.
The Prometheus binaries flags are half of the configuration.
Yes.
But they're not included. The flags are not included in the documentation.
I wasn't aware of this, but given the state of our documentation, I'm not surprised. And yes, they should absolutely be part of our documentation. And yes, version documentation is part of the plan. That we basically always show latest, but you can walk back to older versions. We're talking with CNCF about restructuring stuff, and yeah. And something which we might even be trying is to also keep the upcoming documentation in Git and on the page, but not show it by default, but just like have beta of next version, whatever, as a thing which you can also view on the web. As a secondary point, the discussion about what should be in a file versus what should be as a command line flag is also ongoing, and that's part of what's on the roadmap for the Dev Summit.
Next question up. If the ban on something is up, we could see the future that flags can be provided with environment variables. I believe the question is have we unbanned environment variables from being used instead of flags? Actually,
I don't think we have, and there is a very good case to be made for this not to be made, because by and large, environment variables and flags are pretty much the same thing. They're coming from the same direction. Speaking of how to invoke a thing, yes, I know there's differences, and yes, I've been running Linux on my desktop for 20 years now, so I know where this ask is coming from, but I'm not convinced that it's worth the extra complexity, and I don't think it's a consensus position within Prometheus team either.
It's funny to note that in the 2.18 release, the only way that you can configure Jaeger is by enabling environment variables, so which is an exception, and that broke a lot of users because they had the environment variables laying around. And it's funny that for one thing that we enable with environment variable, it breaks the users.
I have a question. You should definitely check out.
Yeah, I saw it. I'll write it down.
MD
later.
Slides in Markdown. Sounds like a good idea.
Which sounds nice, but LaTeX is even nicer. But the problem is it doesn't allow others to steal from your slides. And as we saw with both Ganesh's and my talk, being able to steal from Gautam saved me easily 30 seconds of slide creation, maybe even 2 minutes. So that's also something to keep in mind. But I'll check out CodeMD. Thank you. So, anything on Slack? There is a question about M mapping. I think I'll just hand that one off to probably Brian, or I mean Julius and Ben. You're also fine if you want to answer it, but I'm not the best person to answer this. Who wants to jump in? Question about M mapping.
I think that was a question from the previous talk.
Oh! I'm way back in Slack. Sorry. Okay. Yes, it's from the previous talk. Thank you, Matthias. We should play some heavy metal as. Yeah, but Matthias makes a good point that environment variables are often considered globals, and globals are evil by default. Like I get how they can make a program seem easier at first, but long term they're just a liability. Unless you're programming RPG4, in which case there's a good use case for them for flow control, but I digress. Any other questions?
I have a statement on the configuration of flags versus config file, and how and why we do it the way we do it. We've had this long-standing policy that everything that goes into the config file should be something that Prometheus can dynamically reload. So, and we use the flags as things that can't be reloaded. There's no objection to moving things that are flags into the config file, but we need to change the code so that they are reloadable. And there are a number of things that are flags right now that actually should be reloadable, like retention. Why is retention time and retention size need to be a flag? Well, we just haven't made it a reloadable dynamic feature. And I would love to see retention be in the config file so that users who are running out of storage can easily just deploy a new config and reload without having to restart, as a simple example. But somebody has to do that code. PR is welcome.
Yes, and tacking on, of course, there was a comment in Slack. I'll just read it out. Some context: if you run Prometheus with systemd, it will be easier to provide flag values and environment variables. I know, let's keep that one, then I'll also answer that after. It will be easier to provide flags values as environment variables on a configurable environment instead of modifying existing service units. Yes, that is true. On the other hand, I mean, hate systemd or hate it, both is valid. But the point is, it has a nice property, which is it has a descriptive language for actually dealing with stuff, whereas before you had imperative style and scripts and such. So it's a lot easier to deal with certain aspects of just handling your system. And in my opinion, this actually goes a little bit against the intention of systemd to basically shoehorn environment variables under a thing instead of properly modifying the unit files. But Ben's point is valid. Stuff which should be configurable at runtime should absolutely be in the config file, so you can actually do this without needing to reload, without losing that short part of your storage. And yes, Matthias, I said hate on purpose. So any plans to continue virtual PromCon in the future? So on the one hand, having a virtual PromCon is super nice because it is a lot cheaper to run and it is a lot cheaper to attend, which is obviously super nice. And it's more inclusive. Of course, it means people who couldn't attend beforehand can now all of a sudden attend. It means people don't need to travel, so you don't have any CO2. It also means that people aren't forced to be there, both the audience and the speakers. And the speakers, some of them walked back on prior commitments. I suspect that at least part of this was just like there was no flight booked, there was a hotel booked, they knew there wasn't an empty stage. And people would think, hey, why is that stage empty? Also, attendance can be harder to actually make time for. And just as a data point, we currently have 81 participants in this call, whereas the projection for a in-person event was around 600 people. We sold out 220 before every single time. So there would be more live audience who actually focuses and pays attention instead of being distracted by other things like Ben currently is. I can see on the video, I can see this.
Yeah, I'm managing questions.
Yeah, but there's also other nice stuff, like for example, managing questions is a lot easier, and discussing stuff while that talk is ongoing is a lot easier. If I have to guess, I would say we would probably, like COVID will keep for some time and we'll do a postmortem for this one. And I would like to have a second virtual PromCon this year. As to next year, we will see, and we will also depend on the feedback from people. And again, we will be sending out a survey. Please answer the survey, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. We'll experiment and see where we go, but I don't think we have an actual answer, but I think we will continue to experiment. Yeah, can we have both online and live PromCons in the future? Yes, that's precisely the point. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. We'll see. That's the honest answer. There is less need for an online thing if you can meet in person. And the hallway track is admittedly better. Like the breakout sessions after are super nice, and you should definitely come and join and try this. But being able to sit down and talk as humans conveys a lot more context. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, online isn't as bad as I expected, but it makes for long working days and can overlap with working hours for many people. Yes, that is precisely the point. It's harder to block this. Of course, if you travel and you're not there. Same as if you're at work, no one in your family or so will interrupt you. Of course, you're not there. If you're at home, people just assume, well, you're there, you have time. Usually, if you travel, you'll not be bothered, but if you're sitting there working, even getting that half hour before to just decompress and focus on the thing can be hard. Of course, it's super easy to be distracted, and it's also just people will distract you a lot more easily because they can just walk in on you and they just expect you to keep working. And obviously between EMEA and US and also Asia, to be honest, it's hard to find a time zone which works, which means for EMEA it tends to be in the evenings, for the US it tends to be in the mornings, and Asia is just, well, at night. That's not as much of a problem if you have an in-person, because people need to travel, and so they adapt to the local time zone. It's more of an issue, or it's more visible of an issue if you do online. So. Hybrid conference, yes, both with my FOSDEM hat on and with my Congress hat on. That's something which can work, but it's super hard to actually make work. Like monitoring certain channels and such to relay questions from the audience is something we already tried, and which we'll probably also try and expand and maybe have a designated thing to talk in during a live streaming and such. Yeah, it's not as easy. And the thing about in-person is in-person tends to disregard the online presence. Of course, it's just so much more easier to do in person that people just naturally switch over completely to in-person. So it's really hard. Like also just reading out all the questions and not just answering without giving others the context of what I'm actually replying to is already something which is not natural. It's a learned habit from doing video work at FOSDEM and hating the people who didn't do it, or not hating either. Can you elaborate a bit what Prometheus feature incomplete actually means, LTS, PromQL, Web UI? All of this and more. I considered to make a little bit of what's in the document visible during this talk, and I deliberately decided not to. Of course, it would be unfair to preempt discussion. I don't want to create any public expectations or anything. So basically what's in that document is a secret within Prometheus team, more or less. And once we start discussing this in the Dev Summit, and then we reach consensus, or we don't reach consensus, but still write it down, then we will start externalizing this, but not before, because this would, like we discussed this during the Dev Summit. Of course, Bartek ran a survey on what should be a backfilling interface on Twitter. And Frederick raised a very fair point that this actually created a kind of expectation / mindset / framing in which that we would be supporting backfilling is already more or less a foregone conclusion. And that's just not fair to the overall discussion and consensus building. So I'm deliberately not talking about anything which is not public. And it's not public for a reason. Are we counting this as a North American event? No, we renamed it to online and removed the Vancouver thing on purpose. Like we even removed the picture on purpose. But we know that it'll be in Vancouver next year, because that's when that's basically the venue allowed to postpone, but not to actually cancel. So for simple reasons, also because Vancouver is super awesome, that'll be the next one. In-person conference would be definitely exciting to attend, yes. And one thing which we are very much aiming for with PromCon is to maintain this family vibe. Anyone who ever attended will probably attest to this, that it feels like a gathering of friends, not so much like a tech conference. And this is something which is quite hard and intricate to make work, but it can be made to work. And the result just makes all the effort more than worthwhile. So yes, once we have in person again, you should absolutely try and attend. What's the best place to propose get involved in things like metadata topics? GitHub issues, yes, GitHub issues. Like, again, this is part of uncrusting Prometheus as a whole, somewhere in between the mailing list and GitHub issues. We might also start experimenting with public design documents more. We'll see, but this is one of the areas which I think we need to improve upon. Any other questions? Also, I think I'm way over time, but that's another nice thing about the virtual stuff. Yeah, we're actually 10 minutes over time.
I guess we should go into lightning talks.
Yes.
Can I first thank you, RichiH, but also Brian, Julius, Ben, and the Prometheus team for organizing this. But we should also thank Katie from the CNCF and all his team to deal with this virtual event and also getting the physical event moved on. So this was not easy. It was a lot of work. I also want to thank the speakers who took the time to prepare the conference in that strange times, and also Lucas from KikoChat for helping us with that platform and assisting us in the conference as well. And I have probably forgotten many people, and we thank everyone who made this possible.
So one person, Vanessa Herrick, also from CNCF. I think that covers most of it. Yeah, and the one thing which I usually do during the in-person is to get everyone, literally everyone, on stage at the end, and that is also the plan for after the lightning talk. That everyone just basically switches on the video and waves into the camera and shares a round of virtual applause.